some questions. Yaron, please.
A question for Lital and might be also relevant to your presentation. I wonder if we have some knowledge or information about how literary works or translations in Judeo-Arabic were perceived by big advocates, non-Jewish advocates of the Nahda, in the sense that, and that's where we come also to what Yuval was talking about, there's definitely element, the way I can think about it, that is anti-modernist actually, because the whole idea of modernism is like standardization. It's the idea of, we can think about imagined community in the place of print, press here, and it is also connected to tradition versus modernity. So do you see this aspect as in a way challenging the broader thing that you talked about as modernity?
Emil and Daniel after that.
Thank you very much for excellent presentations, Zvi. I wish your thing could have gone on for an hour, because it was very interesting. I got a question for you and also for Annie. First, what is the connection between the Sassoons and the East India Company? Second, how could they have built these millions in such a short period of time? I know it was, in a way, pre-prepared, but we know that David Sassoon had left Iraq in the 1820s, and then by 1840, 1850, he's such a multimillionaire, he's a billionaire. He was, great philanthropist. It's a puzzle how quickly they made their money, although I understand the question of the railways. The other question, what was the involvement of the Sassoons in the Boxer Wars? Because we're coming to opium. I mean, we got a Sassoon here, maybe he would help us. Annie, with regard to Haskalah Sassoon, he was, Haskalah Sassoon, he was with the Progress and Union Party. Now that party changed tack. Initially it was very liberal, democratic, and changed totally to become very oppressive and dictatorship, really. They were very much involved in the Armenian genocide. When did Haskalah Sassoon leave them? Because he must have left them at some stage. I don't believe he continued with them. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, we're going to have 3 ones in there. Keep your questions crisp.
Yeah. 2 short. Yeah. Thank you. Fascinating presentations. 2 short questions to Lital and Yuval. Lital, I'm curious about the relations between form and content in the magazines you present, and specifically the choice of Rashi script, and how does it fit with the general project of popularizing metropolitan, cosmopolitan literature for Jewish readers. And to Yuval, I'm curious, the last slide you showed from Yehuda's Proverbs point to the source of every proverb. So one of them was Eretz Israel, the other was Bavli, Babylonian, and the third was Arabic Hebrew. So I'm curious, what was the indigenous, or what was the folk geography that these people entertained, and how did it change in the 20s and 30s and 40s? Because I assume like they're calling Palestine Eretz Israel is already a form of political projection. And thank you.
Let's have another round. Maybe Lital can fit both questions.
I can,
And then
thanks.
Yuval follow, and then Annie and I will address the.
So I'll start with Daniel's question first and then go back to your own question. So, I mean, they just use Rashi script. Like, I don't know enough about the origins of it to say why Iraqi Jews published in Rashi script, but that was what they used historically. So, I mean, it would have actually, to the contrary, it would have been strange to use the square Hebrew script because they just didn't use it traditionally. So I don't think there would have been a perceived contradiction. That was just a script that they used. As for, sort of his intent, I mean, again, you have to keep in mind that this is more the exception than the norm in terms of what Twena was publishing there in his supplement. Mostly he was publishing his own sermons and things whose content would have been perceived as more traditional. So actually I would flip the question around and say, why was he publishing cosmopolitan, metropolitan literature in his supplement? And that's where at the end I said, was it to improve the sales? Was he adapting sort of the Haskalah Project of trying to introduce his readers to this type of material? I don't know. I mean, this is exactly the question that I'm working on. But that also bridges it to Yaron's question about Judeo-Arabic and modernity, and is there sort of a contradiction there? And I mean, again, the point is that he's trying to, this is a community newspaper meant for Baghdadi readers who are spread throughout the trading network in the diaspora, and it's linking them together. And so you have to think, who is the intended audience, right? And so within that context, what else would he use besides Judeo-Arabic? That's sort of the point. It's a newspaper intended for Baghdadi readers in their own language. No, but sort of do I see that as being sort of in tension with the modernizing project? Well, I mean, yes and no. So, I mean, but I'm trying to keep the answer short, but if you look at sort of the bigger picture of Judeo-Arabic literature during this revival and its relations to Fusha, which was, I think, what you were driving at with your question. Like I said in the beginning of the talk, I mean, it's hard to do this briefly, but I'll try to just in 1 or 2 sentences. So if we look at who's writing which, the people who are writing Fusha, for the most part, like I said, are the Effendiya, and they're laymen, they're not rabbis. And they're products of these new educational institutions. And they're writing it to be part of the Nahda, and it's not specifically a Jewish audience. And the people who are using Judeo-Arabic are trying to communicate some of the same ideas and goals, but specifically to a Jewish audience. So it's more a question of audience. I don't think they perceived what they were doing, using the language as being anti-modern, as just targeting a different audience. But what you do see is that as you get into the 20th century, Judeo-Arabic disappears. Because yes, by that point, most of the Jewish readership has adapted to Fusha or European languages, and there isn't a need for it anymore. So it kind of goes, like the last one in Iraq that's meaningful is like short-lived, this bilingual Hebrew Judeo-Arabic publication that appears for a couple of years in the 1920s, and then it's finished, and people are basically just reading Fusha. So there's like a moment in time where they're trying to achieve the same goals using Judeo-Arabic as, writers of Hebrew and Yiddish and Ladino were trying to achieve in those languages. You have to sort of look at it within the broader framework of the Haskalah Project.
Yuval, would you like to take the other question about
geography?
Yeah, so we'll stay with.
Yes. So for the question of Daniel, I think it's a really good question, and it's of course all over the 3 volumes that was published. That is marking different kind of geographies of these proverbs. So you have the Bavli, you have the Maghrebi, Ma'aravi, you have the Eretz Israeli, and you have the Parsi sometimes. But I think that first of all, I see it as he sees it as a global project. He sees it as building an imagined community that even though they have different geographies, he wants to put them in a moment differently maybe from Twena. He's in a moment that everybody's writing in Hebrew already. It's in 1930s in Palestine. He wants to do exactly in a way, if I get in your point, Yaron, is to resist this kind of monolingual transition, either to Arabic, that in the same time his colleague in Iraq will go only to Arabic from this multilingual perspective, or to Hebrew. And he is trying to imagine this kind of multilingual, because you have Persian there, and you have Spanish there, and you have Aramaic there, in this same text. So it's geography and language multiplicity.
Yeah. I'm going to address this question very, very briefly. While they make a lot of money, it's not just the Sassoons. Let's say if we want to try to move from the general to the particular. So generally, if you look at 18th century global economic situation. So you have two powerhouses in the world, among many, but the two prominent powerhouses in the world is not England and China, but it's actually England and the Yangtze Delta in China. And the Yangtze Delta is limited in terms of, because it's not integrated in global trade the way Manchester, for example, is. So the arrival of railways and steamships to this area unleashes one of the most important powerhouses of economic production in the whole world. Okay, so it's a global phenomenon. So when these people come in, they make enormous amount of money very, very quickly because of the abundance of labor, the abundance of products and commodities that are suddenly unleashed onto the system. Until then, the economic system was quite limited to the China Sea trade. So they're not the only ones. Kherdun, for example, comes as a poor boy, and he becomes the richest man in Asia. I mean, by the way, after he died, his brothers in Iraq sued for his fortunes. They sued Liza Kherdun for his fortunes, and they actually used Islamic law. They said that according to Islamic law, they deserve more of her share, and the British court in Shanghai, of course, dismissed them very, very quickly. So they make a lot of money very, very quickly because this is an enormous amount of economic power that's suddenly unleashed onto the world, and they happen to be there. Now, what makes them unique as Iraqi Jews as opposed to other people who come there, I think is because they use this, at the same time they use traditional, this is a modern capitalist system, but there is at the same time traditional trade network systems, etc., which are based on families, they're based on trust, based on religion and language and so on, as the Indian Ocean used to work with, for instance, Hadramis, in the earlier period, and other Armenians and other and so on. So that gave them an advantage over others. They kept hiring Baghdadi Jews the entire time, or most of the entire 19th century. They kept hiring Baghdadi Jews and relied on them for the internal trades. As to the Boxer Rebellion, that's a very complicated topic. I'm hoping that actually what Joseph Sasson, who's been reading the internal correspondence, will shed more light on what happened there. But from a Chinese history point of view, I mean, the Boxer Rebellion was a decidedly anti-Western, as opposed to the Taiping before, anti-Western and targeted Westerners inside China. But it was mostly in the north, in Shandong, and in Tianjin, and later on in Hebei and Beijing. I don't know how much they were affected by this. And so on, although we have a Jewish narrative of this by an American rabbi from Boston who went to China and was captured by the Taipings because they thought he was a priest. And he wrote letters about describing the rebellion to his brother in Poland, and they were published in 1904. Okay, Annie.
Thank you. So there's a longer answer, and there's a medium answer, and there's a brief answer. So I'll give you the brief answer now, and then I'm happy to speak about the internal politics of the CUP at length later. But I mean, the CUP, while in power, continued to reconfigure and reconsolidate. And so, I mean, it does come down to party politics and election politics. And so there was a matter of fact that the deputies had, I mean, just like in elections today, they could get voted out of power. And so there were other aspects as well, but there was another election in 1912, and so the period of time between 1908 and 1912, there was opposition to the CUP, the Moderate Liberal Party, which turned into the Liberal Entente. And so there was concern by the CUP in Istanbul that there would be greater opposition to the CUP, and that they would lose the majority that they had. And so the 1912 elections are called the election of the clubs, and so what happened was they were trying to control who would get into the Ottoman Parliament, and trying to prevent the decentralization focus in the Arab provinces, so that it would be mostly still CUP controlled. And so the entire time that Sassoon Effendi and actually the other Jewish deputies, the other three, who were in the Ottoman Parliament, they always maintained their CUP affiliation so that they could get re-elected to the Ottoman Parliament. So it's a matter of what was efficient for them so that they could have CUP backing and be returned to the Parliament. Whether or not they supported the actions that were made by the triumvirate, then that's a different story. But the matter of their official party support on the ballot, Sassoon Effendi was always officially aligned with the CUP, even though sometimes he may have supported certain aspects of decentralization or had more Iraqi regionalist support.
We have Yosi on Hannah Morgenstern and the gentleman in front of me. Please, Yosi.
It is indeed, for me at least, kind of enlarging knowledge, talking about chapters that, and I guess that I'm not the only one that's not aware of it or that being in the dark. So thank you very much, really. It is fascinating presentations. Now, as to some of the presentations made by you, and I guess that maybe Lital and Yuval in particular, there is kind of sense of eulogizing lost opportunities. And I'm wondering, I'm asking you, maybe it is not within the sphere of your expertise and scope of your expertise, if you are actually identifying some kind of continuation to that. What I mean by that, this sort of an element of transnationalism, multilingualism that characterizes the work of young generations, either in Israel and other countries, right? That in a way of as if continuing this sort of I would say challenging, if you wish, a way of writing, or if you wish, Yuval, you were talking about it in your presentation, obliterating rigid dichotomies and distinctions. So to what extent we can still see this kind of writing that actually breaking, obliterating rigid distinctions and dichotomies. Thank you.
Hannah? Right here.
Hi, thank you so much. Those were all really wonderful. I had a kind of general question, maybe a sort of complicated question for Lital and Yuval. And I know that the translation projects that you're discussing are very different from each other in different contexts, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the question of translation methodology, and also, I mean, in relationship to modernity, but also in relationship to the standards of the time and the aims of the translators. So like Lital, you talked a lot actually about and showed a lot about that you could pull a translation methodology from some of your descriptions, but I wanted you to maybe see if you could be a little bit more explicit, because in a way I was interested in the idea that this is kind of like an adaptation, and what that means for translation methodology of the time, if there even was one, and then and also the question of whether or not they were working alone or in groups. And then Yuval, I think like the way that the page is set up, so it looks a little bit like commentary, and whether or not translation is commentary and adaptation, or there's other aims that influence the form and what the translators are trying to achieve. Thank you.
Sir, please.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I have some questions to Mr. Ben-Dor. I want to know about the role of Victor Sassoon in saving some Jews during the Holocaust, or the Sassoon in general. And Khardun with the yeshiva of Mir, if that's all true, those stories. And then to continue with the question of my friend Emil, regarding the Boxer War. Is that true that Victor Sassoon had an army, private army of 20,000 people that the British used for the war? Those are the questions. And I have another question to Yuval. I wonder if you find the same influence of the Arabic culture. You find that in Sami Mikhail writing and Naqash writing. If you find it in the younger generation, say the writing of Eli Amir and Ezra Yechezkel.
They're the younger, yeah.
Yeah, if the influence continued or just finished. Thank you.
Okay, let me answer this briefly, and then you can take. I know Thabit and Gadi, but I do 3, 3, and 2. Okay, let's do. Okay, Gadi was first, and then Thabit, please.
Goodness, this is keeping me fit.
I'm sorry, yes, that's conferences are about seating for most of us, so thanks a lot. Just a general comment for the panel. I'm very grateful for the panel for undermining reified images of modernity. This is what I found most valuable. I mean, we are heirs to a very strange image of modernity forged around 1900. And it's, of course, absolutely modern to work in a world of multiple languages. We are through with this. And in social and economic history, we also know that modern capitalism was constructed in the 19th century on family firms, not on any other legal form. That the Rothschilds or Siemens are actually networks of brothers, sisters, uncles, that nepotism is very modern and very welcome. And this is how you go about it. And it is a question when we speak about modernity still in Mid-Eastern studies, how far we are really getting, taking into account what at the same time is being radically undermined in that strange place called the West.
Yeah, thank you. I have just a quick comment about Sabi's presentation, and I invite you to comment on my comment. Long time ago, when I studied Basra, I noticed that in the 18th century, the British were very loath to actually deal with the Jewish merchants, or even with the Jewish community. The correspondence of the East India Company is full of incredible anti-Semitic letters, and they considered the Jewish merchants to be, in fact, a threat to their interests. They preferred rather to work with Armenian merchants as a way of trying to enter the country. It was only later in the almost up to the mid-19th century, or earlier, perhaps the 1830s, when the British really felt that they had now mastered or really penetrated into Iraq and felt much more confident of their power, that they began to make overtures to various other communities, including the Jewish community and even the Mandaean community. But the Mandaean community was not really very useful to them because they weren't merchants. But there were very clear overtures made to begin to work with them.
Yes. Okay, I'll be very, very brief. Yeah, I didn't, I mean, the British, they didn't like the Jews. What to do? But the Arabic proverb says that, when you run out of horses, you go to war with mice. And I think that their approach was basically mostly utilitarian. You can see this in Josiah's Child, you see this later on in Voltaire, and in Reynolds, and in others, and so on. I think their view changed as their movement to the east, deepened, and they had to rely more and more on skilled minorities for the chances. So I think, here it's a very, very different situation than, it depends where you read it. But I totally agree that, these seemingly two contradictory views of Jews can dwell together sometimes in the same brain, I mean, because I think it's most about utility rather than, what you're going to do with them. Very briefly, Yes, the Jewish community in Shanghai, there's a very basic Jewish solidarity. So there was a lot of help and support, clearly during that period. But it was a very, very complicated, sometimes mixed one. You know, when Russian Jews arrived in Harbin and then later on in Shanghai in 1905 after the pogroms, yes, they helped them, but they also complained that, you know, all the Russian women are too promiscuous. The Russian Jewish women are too promiscuous. Yes, that's a kind of an interesting thing to think about in the context of Russian Jewish women in Israel in the 90s, how they are viewed. The Boxer Rebellion. Victor Sassoon, yeah, he was involved in so many things, but I think that the point is that the anti-Westerness of the rebellion was so explicit that at some point, you know, a lot of money was raised by different parties, you know, in order to fight that, you know, and to fight that rebellion, which really threatened Western interests. You know, I don't know how much. Probably it's a rumor that started, but it definitely is not without merit. You know, an army of 20,000, I would find it hard to believe. Money, yes, probably. Yeah.
The ships would go to India first, and then they would send it to Shanghai, to Victor. And Victor was to support them. And they saved 22,000 Jews. And then the Germans sent an SS officer in order to annihilate them. How? Taking old ships, put them in the ships, and drown them in the sea. And Victor and a Japanese cleric, he was a friend of Victor. He told him the secret, and of course he was executed. But Victor managed to take the Jews and disperse them somewhere, and so he saved 22,000 people from the Holocaust.
Well, no. Okay. Okay.
So it's the story.
I will continue, but no.
Okay. In terms of Yosi's question, I think this is something that I definitely discuss in other work. It's not really actually implicit in this particular work, because what I'm interested in doing here is more expanding the historical narrative of the origins of Jewish modernity and that kind of Haskalah concept and broadening it and showing that Haskalah was global. I'm not really thinking along the lines of, you know, Mizrahim and continuity, but I do that in other work. In terms of translation methodology, so that's a great question, Hannah. I'm very influenced by Olga Borovaya's study of the Ladino translations, romanzos. And so all of these, you know, works of European fiction like Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe were translated into Ladino, and they're all rewritings. They're not direct translations. And in fact, sometimes they're not even attributed to the original, and it's just fascinating. So that's Olga's first book. And so if you look at it again, sort of within the bigger context of the Jewish languages and transmission between them, it starts to make more sense. And that's why I was trying to emphasize at the beginning of my talk that I see this in some ways, although, yes, it's Arabic. And so there is, you know, some kind of maybe oblique relationship to the Nahda, but I actually see this as part of the Haskalah Project because he's translating from the Hebrew. So by the time he's translating, by the time Twaina is translating, he's really following the Hebrew translations very closely. And so it's more of the ethos of the Hebrew translations that you're getting there, which they're already greatly simplified and abridged, and they're just keeping like the outlines of the story and sometimes taking liberties with the plot, and they lose all of the detail and change the characters' names and basically make it safe for Jewish consumption. Like I'm saying, they're sort of kosher versions of these stories. I could tell you more, but I know we're kind of out of time, so maybe we can talk about it in the discussion, over coffee or lunch.
Okay, okay. So Yosi, thank you very much for your question. I think it's of course, I'm thinking a lot about this question doing my research, because part of it, it's always the dangerous when you label this kind of episodes or things that or figures as missed opportunities. You always have this kind of nostalgia for something that lost, but doesn't have any traces into it. And that's why it was very important for me to start with saying that for me, Sami Michael, Shimon Balas, Samir Nakash, if you're going to the young generation, Almog Behar, and others are still, and of course Amira Hess going back to Judeo-Arabic now in her poetry, is still the traces of the same phenomena. But in the same time, yes, we have to acknowledge the tragic sequences of the partition. That always, me as I would say, as a Iraqi second generation or third generation, I'm already in this post-partitioned, even as a scholar, I'm in this post-partitioned environment where you're studying this Judeo-Arabic twina in Hebrew literature, in Arabic literature, in Jewish history, in Arabic history, in Islamic history. What is the languages, to go into a figure like Yitzhak Yehuda's world that he knew, it's something that we are really in a different kind of a space. So it's in the same time to acknowledge this kind of reduction of our, I would say, intellectually horizon. But in the same time to see this continuous fact on traces of these kind of things.
Kind of practices would be translated into some kind of a new political reality, right? So this is like sort of now the question, and that we can say, well, those opportunities that having to do that with the fact that it has not been translated, or they had not been translated into political reality that some people might wish that it could have been, and now if we're talking about sort of continuation of these kind of practices, whether they can in one way or another. And I'm not that it is not that I have a specific kind of a dream, but thinking in a very general way, what kind of political realities could be anticipated by this continuation of this
two-second version. So, I mean, I would say that that's certainly a kind of underlying aspiration that threads through a huge body of scholarship from the last, 15 years of historians and people like Abigail Jacobson and Michelle Campos and myself and Orit and, many people who have been trying to show all the missed opportunities. But I think that it's important to understand that there's political utility and value merely in expanding the historical narrative itself. It doesn't necessarily have to always be about, what's going to happen in the future, but just to go back to what Gadi said, we have a very Eurocentric narrative of modernity. Just the, virtue of changing that narrative is already political, even if we don't end up, changing the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Okay, and with that.
Yeah.